Hi, my name is Andrei. I'm an instructor at Moto Control riding school and I come across this topic quite frequently. Should we always cover the brakes and the clutch while riding? Some people say yes, all the time, because anything can happen at any moment. We never know when we will need our brakes and clutch, so we must be prepared at all times. Other people say no, because we might inadvertently grab the brakes. It's uncomfortable and it can lead to numb hands, among other reasons. So which one is true? The truth is that there is no absolute truth. As usual, there are pros and cons. Instead of trying to impose some stupid rigid rule about always keeping our hands on the controls, which would only be suitable for 50% of riders 50% of the time, it would be much better if I outline which situations can benefit from one approach or the other. With this information, you can decide what suits you the most. First of all, let's outline the general benefits and drawbacks of covering the clutch and brake levers. The most obvious benefit is that by doing so, we're prepared to use them immediately. We can apply the clutch, front brake or rear brake quickly if the need arises. We skip the extra time it takes to move our fingers into position. This might seem insignificant, but consider this. If it takes just 1/10 of a second to shift our fingers to the brake lever while traveling at 100 km/h or 60 miles per hour, in that tenth of a second we would have traveled 3 meters or 10 feet ahead. Thus, even this seemingly small fraction of a second can make a significant difference. It should not be disregarded. A less obvious advantage applies mostly to the front brake lever. The front brake lever can serve as a gauge to feel how much you are precisely opening and closing the throttle. In this case, you are not actually applying the brake, rather you are resting your fingers on it. For this particular method, it is not necessary to keep all 4 fingers on the lever, even just one is sufficient. Now, what are the drawbacks? The primary drawback is that having some fingers on the levers inherently means fewer fingers on the handlebars, reducing our level of control over them. Fortunately, on paved roads, this usually doesn't have a significant impact. As we know, we generally allow the handlebars to guide themselves most of the time, and regular roads typically lack significant bumps that could pull the bars from our grasp. In one of my previous videos, I even conducted an experiment and rode over quite tall speed bumps without gripping the handlebars at all, and it worked out just fine. So in that aspect, covering the levers isn't all that detrimental. However, if you are riding off-road, it's an entirely different scenario. There we usually only use 1 or at most 2 fingers to cover the levers, if we choose to cover them at all. A second drawback that is often brought up is the possibility of accidentally grabbing the levers when they are covered. And indeed, I've seen my students doing this quite a few times, especially during the first couple of lessons. This applies to both the brakes and the clutch. One of the most common reasons for a T-power, for instance, is when a student is executing a maneuver, experiences a brief panic, instinctively grabs the clutch and front brake and drops the bike. Another common occurrence is during slow-speed exercises. Students sometimes unintentionally maintain pressure on the rear brake, causing the brake and the clutch to overheat. I covered this topic extensively in the video about the slow race exercise, as well as in my both video courses. So yes, the accidental grabbing of controls is a factor to take into account. Fortunately, it is a temporary issue that is typically rectified within the first or second lesson, provided your instructor knows what he's doing. Luckily, your favorite instructor knows all about these small aspects that transform you into an awesome rider, so stay tuned to this channel, subscribe and enable notifications. The third argument against covering the brakes is that it can become uncomfortable to maintain your hand in this position for an extended period of time. In this case, I can say that it entirely relies on your individual hand and your bike. For instance, on my KTM, I can comfortably ride with one or two fingers on the brake lever continuously for hours without any discomfort. However, on the Kawasaki Vulcan it was a different story. Both the throttle grip and brake lever were notably larger, leading to less comfort when keeping my fingers on the brake constantly. The comfort level depends on you and your bike. The only suggestion I can provide is to ensure you adjust the lever to suit your comfort. It's possible to adjust it higher or lower, like this. For most people, the optimal lever position is when the wrist remains flat, like this. Therefore, take a few minutes to customize the lever position for yourself. It's remarkable how often people overlook this step despite the considerable impact it has on the comfort. Now that we have outlined the pros and cons, let's discuss situations in which it makes sense to employ them. Let's begin with the front brake, as it's arguably the most crucial part on your bike. Unless you're in India, where it's the second most crucial control, after the horn. When should you cover your brake and how should you do it? It's a practical choice in situations where you might need to brake really fast and without warning, such as when approaching an intersection. At an intersection, someone might attempt to turn right directly in front of you, a bicyclist could suddenly cross the crosswalk, or some driver might run a red light. Stuff like that happens. Similarly, when filtering through traffic, someone could change lanes or open a car door, a pedestrian might attempt to go through the traffic jam. Various unexpected incidents can happen. Thus, it's wise to cover your brake in such cases. Alternatively, if you are cruising on the highway, maintaining a safe following distance, and no potential threats are present, there is no particular reason to cover the brakes. You can still choose to do so if you want, but it is not obligatory. Now, the frequent question: how many fingers should cover the brake? That also depends on the particular bike. For example, on my 690 Duke R, I could easily perform a stop with just one finger, so there was simply no need to use all four fingers. Now, on the 200 Duke, I can achieve rapid stops with two fingers, but it requires applying a significant amount of force, which goes through my forearm and therefore make my arms really tense. I feel much more comfortable doing it with all four fingers. Therefore, it truly depends on your specific brakes. I recommend experimenting with fast and effective braking to see what works best for you. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Another reason to cover your front brake, as I mentioned earlier, is for improved throttle control. Personally, I like to keep one finger on the brake to have better control over the throttle in situations where I need more precise control. For instance, on stock tires and while leaned over like this, abrupt throttle inputs can easily cause the rear wheel to spin, even on seemingly modest 200cc engine. However, this is also a matter of personal preference. Some people use bar and weights or handguards to improve throttle control. So once again, I suggest trying different approaches to discover what suits you the best. One more notable point about covering the front brake is the abundance of misconceptions surrounding it. For instance, the notion that covering the front brake might lead to accidentally grabbing it while the throttle is open, or the belief that using all four fingers for braking will cause you to overbrake and lose traction at the front wheel. These things might sound right, but actually they are not. Why are these myths misguided? Because rather than developing a strong muscle memory for swift and effective braking, they relied on crutches that usually prove ineffective. Consider this hypothetical situation. Let's assume we don't have enough force in two fingers to lock up the front wheel. In reality, this varies depending on the bike, and each of us has different hand strength. Nonetheless, for the sake of the argument, let's just say we can't overbrake with two fingers. Alright, that implies we also can't brake rapidly, doesn't it? It means we are far from approaching the brake's limit, which closely aligns with the traction limit. This belief is misleading. It's a crutch that doesn't hold up. It's crucial to regularly practice fast and effective braking. This is the sole factor which will ensure you respond appropriately when the situation demands it. Not even ABS can replace this. Even the most advanced motorcycles, like the BMW 1250 GS, for example, experience significantly longer braking distances if we make really big mistakes during braking, despite the presence of all those awesome electronics. These systems are great, but they can't compensate for a lack of proper practice. Now let's talk about the clutch. When should we cover our clutch? Generally we shouldn't. There isn't a scenario on the road that suddenly demands an immediate clutch application. When braking, we don't actually have to engage the clutch. We might to, but we don't have to. Even if we decide to downshift during the braking process, we have some time to do so. The only exception where covering the clutch might be useful is during slow-speed riding, especially when we might need to utilize the friction zone, such as when filtering through traffic. In this case, covering the clutch makes perfect sense. As for how many fingers to use, again, it depends on your bike. Some bikes have relatively heavy clutches, where you might feel more comfortable using 3 or 4 fingers. Others have lighter clutches, allowing easy use of 1 or 2 fingers. The number of fingers you use for your clutch doesn't hold significant importance on asphalt, unless you're doing wheelies. In these cases, using just 1 finger is a safe bet. Lastly, let's talk about the rear brake. The rear brake is actually quite difficult. Its efficiency heavily relies not only on your specific bike, but also on your training. Allow me to explain. Firstly, different bikes have different rear brake effectiveness. On many motorcycles, it only holds importance at lower speeds, say below 50-60 km/h or 30-35 miles per hour. On slower speeds, braking can occur within a very short period of time, around 1 to 1.5 seconds. After roughly half a second of fast braking, the weight shifts to the front wheel, making the rear brake less significant. However, on certain long bikes like cruisers or tourers, especially when carrying a passenger, the rear brake retains some significance, contributing around 10% of combined braking power. Consequently, on such bikes, just like with the front brake, it makes sense to cover the rear brake before entering potentially hazardous areas like intersections. But bear in mind that without ABS, the rear wheel can easily lock up during hard braking. Therefore, it's essential to practice rapid and effective braking extensively, otherwise you might risk a high-side crash. This is where your training comes into play. If you're absolutely confident in your ability to handle the rear brake while simultaneously applying 100% of the front brake's force, then use the rear brake. Otherwise, focus your attention entirely on the front brake. Alternatively, if your bike has ABS, you can use both brakes without concerns. In addition to actual braking, there are a couple more situations when you might consider covering your rear brake, particularly at slow speed. You can employ the rear brake during super slow situations to manage your bike, a topic we've extensively covered in multiple videos about slow speed riding. Another beneficial application of the rear brake is to eliminate engine jerkiness when you crack open the throttle. I've addressed this technique in a separate video too. This method is effective not on all speeds, but from approximately 20 to 60 km/h or from 10 to 35 miles per hour, roughly. Beyond that range, the rear brake mostly loses its relevance. And now a quick tip regarding the placement of your foot on the rear brake. If you are practicing steep lean angles while simultaneously using the rear brake, like in Moto Gymkhana style of riding, it could be a smart move to rest only the tip of your boot on the brake lever, like this, to prevent contact with the ground. As you can see, despite being conscious about my foot placement, my right boot's slider is noticeably scuffed. If I had placed my foot further, like this, the slider and the significant portion of the sole would have worn down rapidly. But again, it depends on your specific bike. Your foot peg and rear brake setup might differ. So it's best to see for yourself what suits you. If you want to get better at riding, you should definitely check out my video courses linked below the video. They're packed with useful tips for learning both basics and advanced riding techniques, which will make you a more confident rider. Also, I'm working on a new, very advanced online course right now, designed for riders who already know the basics and want to improve quickly, going from beginner to expert level. This course is like a full package for becoming really skilled on the road, so you can handle almost any situation. It's not finished yet, but it will be soon, so don't miss out. Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated. That's all for today, ride safely and thank you for watching. Bye!